Everyone, thank you for coming back after a lovely lunch. I'm sure it was quite a quick break for you. I'm Hayley McEwen. I'm a senior solicitor with the wonderful Mid North Coast Legal Centre here in lovely Port Macquarie. I'm also have the privilege of being the convener of the Triple R network for CLC New South Wales. I'd like to acknowledge the Biripi people, who are the traditional custodians of the lands that we are joining on today, and to acknowledge their continuing connection to waters, culture and land over thousands of years, and that I have the privilege of walking and working on Biripi country today, which I'm really grateful for. We pay our respects to our First Nations communities and acknowledge their continuity of cultures, languages, leadership, resilience and knowledge systems. And I'd especially like to give a warm welcome to all of our First Nations colleagues who might be joining us in the room or otherwise online. Now, I'll give a very quick introduction to our panellists for today, two of whom are here in person, if you'd like to come up, and one who is joining online. And following that, each of them will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes. And following those conversations, there'll be some questions directed to the panel and then some time for audience Q&A towards the end. So make sure you get your questions ready. Now, I just, in preparation for this session, pulled up some quotes which struck me in the context of talking about AI and the social impact of it. The CEO of Google has said AI has the potential to be more transformative than electricity or fire. CEO of Microsoft has said AI is going to be the key to understanding and solving many of the world's most complex problems. Elon Musk has said AI is likely to be either the best or worst thing to happen to humanity. So given that the future of AI is not predetermined, today we'll explore the questions on how we can harness the benefits of AI while effectively mitigating its risks that are presented to our social and human rights. Llewellyn Spink, who is seated on my left, your right, manages the Human Technology Institute's AI Corporate Governance Program, which aims to broaden understanding of corporate accountability and governance in the use of AI. Prior to this, Llewellyn was a senior lawyer at the Australian Human Rights Commission, where he provided advice to the Commission on domestic and international human rights issues and worked with the Human Rights Commissioner on the Commission's human rights and technology projects. Llewellyn also worked as a senior lawyer at the Disability Royal Commission and as a commercial disputes lawyer in private practice. Louise Buckingham is the CEO of the Arts Law Centre of Australia, a lawyer and academic with 25 years specialising in intellectual property law and Indigenous cultural and intellectual property rights. Prior to this, she worked in corporate law, in-house legal and the non-profit sector, cultural and education sectors, including in Sydney, London and California. She's committed to the arts and creators' rights and lectures in New South Wales IP and cultural heritage and art law in law, arts and science faculties. And Dr. Tamika Worrell is joining us online. Hello, Tamika. And she is a senior lecturer with the Centre of Critical Indigenous Studies at Macquarie University. Tamika's family is from Gamilaroi country, and she's grown up with Darug country, Western Sydney, since birth. Her research focuses on empowering Indigenous peoples in higher education and exploring the nuanced complexities of Indigenous representation in education, including the emerging field of artificial intelligence. So, Llewellyn, would you like to take the lectern?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm from the Human Technology Institute at UTS. We are an institute that's focused on bringing human values and human rights into new technologies, particularly artificial intelligence. We were founded by one of Australia's former human rights commissioners, Professor Ed Santow, and we work in both kind of looking at AI models, looking at AI governance, and looking at sort of AI regulation and policy. And so today I wanted to talk to you about the risks and harms of AI systems, both in terms of what they pose to individuals and to society, and how good governance can help us prevent some of those harms. Before we get to that, though, I do think it's important to start with asking, what do we actually mean when we're talking about artificial intelligence? When people say AI these days, they're usually talking about generative AI tools like ChatGPT or Claude. But actually, AI is a broad term. Generative AI is just one subset of artificial intelligence. There is actually no real standard or universal definition for what AI is. It's really more of a marketing term at the moment. And any of these techniques or technologies that are listed on the right could be considered and are considered as artificial intelligence. I've included HTI's definition of what we think artificial intelligence is, which is really about using machine or digital-based systems that do advanced tasks like generating content, providing advice, making recommendations or decisions. So when we talk about the harms of AI systems, people often jump straight to sort of the existential threats of killer robots and terminators, but actually AI systems are having real world impacts on people today and are already having impacts on people's human rights. And there are a number of different ways that they can do this. I've set out some of the ways I think AI can influence particularly vulnerable groups, particularly groups like your clients, and with examples of what we're already seeing. So one of the big issues with AI systems is around bias and discrimination. When AI systems are trained on data from the real world is full of bias and inequality. And the training data reflects those biases. So the AI system learns those biases. Amazon, for example, developed a recruitment tool which learned to downgrade female CVs for technical roles. That was because it was trained on the CVs of its male engineers, and there were very few female engineers in the company at that point. So it learned to preference men over women. These systems also perform poorly when dealing with minorities, often because there's a lack of data to train them. So facial recognition technologies is often less accurate for people of color. Voice analysis can make more mistakes when dealing with people with disabilities. So, and in this way, AI systems don't just reflect existing biases, they can help entrench them. AI systems are also fundamentally dependent on data. We're seeing AI tools being used to make assessments of people, in terms of job applications or rental applications. And often that requires people to hand over huge amounts of personal data. And that creates significant privacy risks because that data may be poorly secured, may be vulnerable to access by third parties, or it may be improperly used by those organizations. We saw in the US recently that McDonald's McHire chatbot app was hacked and millions of people's personal information was exposed. And closer to home here in Australia, Bunnings has been found to have breached Australia's privacy regulations through its use of facial recognition technology in stores without getting sufficient consent from customers. AI systems are also increasingly being used as part of that assessment and decision-making processes in terms of access to services. And in that way, they can become gatekeepers to these services. So when they make errors, it can be really difficult to kind of challenge and overcome those decisions. These systems often operate with fairly limited transparency. They're kind of black boxes. And that makes it harder for people to understand why they were denied something, and then harder to kind of appeal and challenge those decisions. And, a stark example here in Australia is obviously Robodebt. Whilst that probably technically wasn't AI, it's more of a poorly applied algorithm. It does show what happens when you have automated decision-making with limited rights of kind of review and appeal to challenge those decisions. And it's not just the decisions themselves, but it's also how we access these services. As organizations are increasingly relying on online platforms or using AI chatbots to provide customer service, people without reliable internet access, people with low levels of digital literacy or with disabilities are at risk of being locked out of some of these services. AI is also being used to deceive people, both by scammers committing fraud and even by companies who are trying to mislead consumers. There's a huge rise in AI-powered fraud. Deep fake technology is now incredibly sophisticated. There was a case where a man in a financial institution transferred $25 million after having a video call with several people from a company who were all AI generated, and he had no idea. On the other hand, like I said, companies are using AI to influence people through what are called dark patterns. So they're trying to push consumers down particular paths to make particular choices. One example, in Australia, the ACCC brought proceedings against Trivago for misleading consumers. Trivago was a hotel comparison website. It led consumers to believe it was giving them ranking hotels based on the best deal for them. In fact, it was ranking them based on the highest commission paid to the website. The ACCC was ultimately successful and fined, Trivago was fined $44 million. But it shows how the AI systems can really distort choices and steer people towards outcomes. There are also a range of psychological, physical, financial, and reputational impacts that AI can have. You know, in the US, there are cases of self-driving cars hitting, even killing pedestrians. In the US, there's also currently a case being brought against an online platform called Character AI, which provides character chatbots for people to talk to. And a claim's been brought by the family of a man who was interacting with one of these chatbots who had some severe mental health issues, and those interactions ultimately are allegedly led to his suicide. So these are kind of extreme examples, but they show that AI can have real-world impacts on people. And just maybe to briefly mention some of the harms to society. Like I said, AI is making it easy to generate those deep fakes. That's not only going to be easy to deceive consumers, but it can have political and democratic, influences. It can be used to spread conspiracy theories, and it can lead to the erosion of public trust, because if you can't tell what's fake, then you also have trouble telling what's real. AI-powered recommendation algorithms that we see on social media are kind of pushing us down particular pathways or filter bubbles, which is increasing polarization. AI is also risks kind of deepening inequality. At the moment, a lot of these AI systems are owned by a handful of very powerful US companies. So if they continue to extract profit and lead to job losses, it's going to be those companies that see the value of this. So that's not also sort of between nations, but within countries, there's that digital divide where people in rural areas may not have the same access to this technology. AI is likely to influence the labour market. There are wildly different statistics you can find on this. Some estimates say 300 million jobs may be affected by AI. Others talk about much less, but then the new jobs that are also going to be created by AI. I think regardless, we're seeing already in sectors like customer service, like retail, that there is automation coming. So younger workers or women, regional communities, they may be more exposed to displacement given their overrepresentation in some of these roles. There's also the environmental impact to consider, which I think we're increasingly becoming aware of. Generative AI actually uses a huge amount of electricity, of water, of land to house and run the data centers that power these systems. In fact, Microsoft and Google have both had to delay their net zero goals because of really the use of AI. And there's really actually quite limited transparency around the actual environmental impact that those systems are having. This is quite a pessimistic slide, so maybe I can just leave you with a bit of hope. These harms aren't all inevitable, and in fact, they're not all unregulated either. Sometimes people talk about AI existing in a wild west, but it's not true. There are a whole range of existing laws that apply to technologies, to companies using AI or governments using AI, just as they would to them using any other technology. So, we have privacy, cybersecurity, IP laws relating to data, the usage. We have consumer protection laws. We have work health and safety laws and duty of care to protect people for some of the harms that I've mentioned today. And we are seeing governments and regulators issue more guidance on what is expected from organizations, and particularly in terms of the governance, which I will come back to you later and talk about. And there is also new regulation currently being considered by the Australian government in relation to high-risk AI systems. So in short, there are a lot of risks there, but there are some regulations that will help us in this space, and governance will also help us, which I will talk about a bit later on. Thank you.
Thank you. And that's really helpful for me because I'm usually the voice of doom and gloom in these kinds of sessions, adopting the perspective of artists who are our clients at Arts Law, and being concerned about the implications for various vulnerable communities who are, artists themselves, or who are economically empowered by the work of artists and the income that's generated there, and that stream of revenue and livelihood being undermined. So I'm very grateful that we had the previous slide that kind of pointed to all of the risks and issues with generative AI. And I suppose what I thought I would do to sort of give you a lens that is probably slightly different to one that you may have heard before in terms of legal practice generally, and keeping in mind, I suppose it's a sort of caveat to say at the outset that artists are interested in using technologies too, like generative AI, to harness it and use it for all of the useful things that it can be helpful for too. However, the impact is pretty direct, and the threat is pretty real for artists and the arts across the board. And so the way in which artists' rights have been kind of subtly undermined, and we sort of have it is an existential crisis really on our hands in terms of the laws that we've looked at to traditionally protect artists, in the form of our intellectual property laws that we usually draw on to help, like copyright and moral rights, trademarks and so on. And some of you may have heard of the promised Indigenous cultural and intellectual property legislation, which is also going to have to contend with the reality of AI in practice too. And I think that the sort of undermining is the best word for it of these areas of law is the most sort of direct way that we've seen the impact of generative AI on our clients. And it's sort of increasingly easy to point to because we're getting increasing numbers of queries that are based on artists' concern, ranging from musicians who are not being paid their royalties because their streaming platforms don't regard the work that they think they've created with the assistance of generative AI as being sufficiently original to warrant those payments, to authors who have uploaded whole chunks of their manuscripts or chapters of their books to ChatGPT, and don't sort of understand that it's not a sort of editing tool or a helpful tool that is there to assist them, to people who think that they have created something in which copyright subsists or exists, and thus that they can protect that work, only to learn that they can't, as far as we know, because of the rules that surround this area. So I thought it would be useful walking you through a very high level sort of discussion of copyright and generative AI. I have some old-fashioned printout leaflets to leave people with that are an information resource that's available on the Arts Law website, that may be helpful for everyone anyway, but potentially also for clients who intersect with the arts or whose communities do. And this is in part because in many ways we're waiting for guidance in this area in terms of the law. There's a lot of litigation on foot in other jurisdictions. There's nothing directly on point in Australia yet, and so we're looking to other jurisdictions, the US in particular, for outcomes. But if we apply the principles that we have from pre-generative AI even being imaginable in Australia, we know what the law is. And I think we're possibly looking at a situation where there's an enormous gap between the application of the law and principles like our IP laws, for instance, that should come in to protect creators and artists but already aren't in practice, and where we sort of should be in terms of justice. So for those of you who don't know, copyright arises automatically in content that we all create every day, and so do artists, including in vulnerable communities and First Nations communities who are producing work that really empowers, reflects culture, and provides livelihood for, you know, lots of family and community members. We've had the copyright system in Australia for many, many years, and our version of it comes from very Anglo-centric, arguably, you know, inappropriate in lots of ways, Statute of Anne from England in 1709 or 1710. That's where it sort of stems from. And there is no way that that particular law in any way imagined generative AI and where we are now. But the way that it works in theory now, when copyright exists in anything we write or draw, or that we perform in terms of a creation, music that we compose, or what we call dramatic works, that it can be things like choreography as well, and now in things like film and sound broadcasts, it then lasts, generally speaking, for the life of the artist plus 70 years, which is why having wills in place and people understanding the rules of intestacy where they're not is really important for communities who are dependent on artists' livelihoods and what they can provide for. We've also had moral rights in Australia since 2000, which are about the artists themselves, regardless of who owns copyright as an asset. And the point really is that these two sort of principles or ways of viewing the benefit of art, or ways of protecting art, and I mean art in an incredibly broad sense to cover all creative disciplines really, the way that they're meant to work is that copyright provides intangible assets that can be dealt with, you know, just like any other form of asset. They can be leveraged, licensed, rented out, bequeathed, given, or sold in order to, you know, create a revenue stream for an artist. But regardless of that, since 2000 in Australia, we've also had moral rights, which are about the connection or recognising the connection between the artist, and again, that can be the writer, the filmmaker, so on, and their creation. And they're inalienable rights that stick with the artist regardless of ownership. And all of these rights are intimately connected with lots of our human rights instruments as well, in various ways. So in theory, that's how things are meant to work. The idea is that this means people will be incentivized and encouraged to create the wonderful materials that we all benefit from in terms of teaching and learning, in terms of, you know, thriving creative economy that everyone enjoys and gets so much from. And the way that it then works in practice is people who own or have these rights to utilize can stop those who shouldn't be using them from using them. They're exclusive rights for the owners. And then in comes, any form of generative AI and its capacity to ingest and scrape the internet and use content that is accessible regardless of who owns copyright in it, and regardless of any concerns about culture or giving permission to use that work or ways of acknowledging that work. And in theory, the ways that, as is reflected in most of the litigation that's on foot at the moment, the sort of challenge or the contention of artists is that their work has basically been stolen to power these systems and tools. They're not being compensated. Their moral rights aren't being upheld or acknowledged, and this is a problem. We also have principles that underpin copyright law in Australia, but also really everywhere in the world, that say that in order for copyright to exist in any of this content, it has to be human created or human authored. And so we also have a set of decisions from the US Copyright Office. We don't have an equivalent here in Australia because we can't register copyright work in Australia, whereas in the US, that's a part of the system. But we have this guidance from the US, from their Copyright Office, that says unequivocally, in terms of artwork that's been generated through, Midjourney or DALL-E, or text that's been generated through ChatGPT, for instance, that it is not copyright protected content. And that's because the systems or tools have generated it rather than humans. And that was even the case in one example where someone made 674 prompts in order to come up with the particular text that accompanied images in a work. Even that wasn't regarded as being sufficiently human to qualify for copyright protection, which really just means subsistence. So you can see all of the ways in which the law should work or may work in theory, that would have creators who come to arts law who are concerned about their work being ripped off or used without their permission, or misappropriation having occurred for something that matters to them or their community through use of the tools, or them not being acknowledged as the artist whose work something, looks like it was based on, but the person who's prompted the work, they might have put in a seemingly sort of innocuous prompt like create a work in the style of such and such. And though we might hope that our consumer protection laws would come into play or passing off, and we might hope that if a court were actually to analyse the issue, if it eventually is an issue that our courts in Australia look at and work out whether the output is close enough to an original work for copyright infringement to have occurred, it's a really sort of hard task at the moment, and that the train's already sort of far down the track. So you can perhaps understand why for artists across Australia, it's increasingly a big concern, and perhaps should be for all of us in terms of wanting to ensure that that the creators of the valuable content that's powering these tools, which the big tech companies are profiting so enormously from, it actually flows back to creators as well. So that's probably enough for now to give you that little high level sort of summary of artists' rights and concerns. I think I sort of gave you a picture at the outset about the kinds of questions that we get really daily now from our artist clients who are sure that their work has been used in some way, but the challenges of demonstrating that and being able to, or even just wanting to undertake any kind of litigation is obviously a huge hurdle too. But to do anything about it is almost impossible at the moment. So we hope that we can influence, I guess, a better normative set of behaviours and conduct through awareness raising about these concerns, including in relation to Indigenous cultural and intellectual property and the promised legislation, which will be, significantly undercut if it's unable to deal with the sort of misappropriation that may flourish if it goes unchecked. Yeah.
Thanks, Louise. I think we'll hand over to Tamika now.
Right, can you hear me?
Yes, thanks, Tamika.
Beautiful. And can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Sorry.
Just I thought I'd better check before I get underway. Yama everyone, and thank you for having me here today virtually. I'll be discussing Indigenous considerations for the use of generative AI, and I'll be sharing from a lens of critical Indigenous studies and proposing some considerations for Indigenous peoples and communities when it comes to AI. I'd like to acknowledge country. I'm on Darug Noora, Darug country. This is the country that I've been grown up by as a Gamilaroi woman. I'm very grateful to both live and work here. and I honour direct ancestors and peoples, as well as all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples that may be listening in today, as well as the lands where this gathering is taking place and anyone listening in online. So AI is often framed as a revolutionary force, reshaping labour, governance and knowledge production. Yet for Indigenous peoples, AI is not simply a neutral technological advancement, but an extension of colonial systems that continue to extract, distort and commodify Indigenous knowledges, lands and bodies. This afternoon, I'll briefly explore some of the challenges and potential harms to Indigenous peoples and knowledges. I should note that I'm not an AI expert. My expertise is in Indigenous education. I interrogate representation across Indigenous content inclusion, and I'm continuing to research the frontiers of this area. As an educator, I know that these tools are being used by students in the classroom, but how do these technologies and ones like it impact Indigenous peoples? And how do we balance the digital divide and ensure that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are not being left behind, but also ensuring that we are aware of the very valid and very real concerns? So let me introduce you to my uncle, Uncle Chatty G. So I use this term colloquially in a tongue-in-cheek way to refer to the generative AI tool ChatGPT. The use of uncle in this instance is indicative of a relationship, and in this case with an artificial technology. I describe Uncle Chatty to fellow Indigenous peoples as that uncle of yours at a barbecue, constantly having something to say, always with a positive inflection to it. Uncle Chatty G is much like this, always giving a positive spin on the response and always and ever communicating. So there are a range of potential harms that I want to explore today. Firstly, the source which generative AI gathers knowledge. Secondly, the spreading of misinformation and disinformation. Thirdly, the environmental impacts on country. And lastly, data sovereignty and cultural IP. So Indigenous people have historically and continue to be overwhelmingly targeted by structural and strategic misinformation. AI learns from and draws its information from data. The data that is produced about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples is often highly problematic and inaccurate, and Indigenous scholars have spent the past 3 decades debunking misinformation and disinformation that has been provided as factual. Concerningly, there are no mechanisms in place to ensure the content accessed by AI is accurate or culturally safe. Based on this, there is significant harm here to reproduce harmful misinformation about us. Whilst Indigenous knowledges are expanding in the academy and beyond, white perspectives and scholars have had a head start on generating knowledges about us. We often see this demonstrated through a common slogan in our research spaces: nothing about us without us. As an industry, it is also male-dominated in both creation and management. Research has revealed that AI discriminates as it works to reproduce the society in which it has been developed, including biases, stereotypes, and threats to Indigenous cultural intellectual property rights. If the corpus of knowledge generative AI is drawing from is reinforcing colonial and Western perspectives, it too will regurgitate and reinforce these ideas, including social biases and racism. So when considering the corpus of knowledge, I draw on a prominent problematic example. Creative Spirits is a website ran by a non-Indigenous man who profits extensively off of Indigenous knowledges. If you Google the word Aboriginal and your topic of interest, it's very likely that the first hit will be Creative Spirits. We see ample ad revenue generated from this website. This is something we often battle with students who seem to always find ways to cite this information. I've also seen this website cited in government documents, including health ones. Sullivan and McLean describe Creative Spirits as a website that has persistently misappropriated and misrepresented Indigenous knowledges. So what does our Uncle Chatty G think of Creative Spirits? Uncle likes it. So we know that people are engaging with generative AI as a source of truth without engaging with Indigenous voices and Indigenous peoples directly. Whilst this is likely not a question that would be asked, it does bring into the question that brings into question the ways that OpenAI establishes authority, or more accurately, fails to do so. This is a part of the corpus of knowledge that generative AI is drawing from. So talking about misinformation and disinformation, as well as online harm. So the potential of generative AI to spread misinformation and disinformation is growing. It's particularly amplified by social media, which already sees Indigenous peoples experience extensive violence. In October 2023, the referendum results saw 60.6% of the population vote no. Whilst I won't dive into the impacts of the outcomes of this result, I do want to point out the role that AI played. During the referendum campaign, it was being utilised to generate images of ambiguously Indigenous faces, including those of children, to portray a sense of authority in the plight of a no vote. This is also seen on the bottom right through an AI-altered artwork. This is the artwork of an Aboriginal man local to me who was an avid yes voter and campaigner. He had this artwork taken from him, vote no, written across it using generative AI tools, and then this was then used in a flyer to encourage people to vote no. That flyer was distributed throughout Victoria and New South Wales. So the use of AI to create Indigenous authority where there is none is concerning. As these technologies continue to grow, so does the environmental impact. Little is known about the impacts these technologies are having on country. A recent study has identified that ChatGPT drinks a bottle of water per 20 to 50 prompts. Whilst there's not currently a data set on the impact of this on Indigenous lands, it is known that data centres that support these technologies require extensive water support to allow for suitable cooling. Globally, it is well established the need to preserve water sources and waterways, as well as the relationships we have with them. Further, recent research projected that e-waste produced by AI by 2030 will be 2.3 million tonnes per year, the equivalent of throwing away 13.3 billion iPhone 15s. Nice segue from the previous presentation, which touched on this as well, but there are deep concerns for not only cultural intellectual property rights being breached, but the introduction of a new digital market where non-Indigenous peoples can profit from Indigenous knowledges. Indigenous artwork remains a continuing priority when it comes to discussions of AI. Indigenous data sovereignty must continue to be at the forefront of these conversations and cemented in all fields, particularly as we consider AI and technology. We see this complementing nicely with ICIP. The importance of these is heightened as we've often not been given a choice when it comes to our data or our cultural knowledges, making it even more integral that we are able to engage in self-determination and govern our own data. A new national body on data sovereignty, Mayam Nari Wangara, is now leading the Indigenous sovereignty government space. We've included 3 helpful definitions from them here. It should be noted that the Australian Government's interim report on safe and responsible AI use from last year makes no reference to Indigenous peoples, indicating a significant issue concerning Indigenous involvement in these conversations. When it comes to generative AI, it is a very fine line between exploring a fun and cool technology and providing this machine learning tool information relating to our cultural practices. We see this in particular as our social media networks are embedded deeper and deeper with AI. So some concluding thoughts. Ensuring that AI is held accountable, grounded in Indigenous governance, relational ethics, and the protection of country requires ongoing interrogation as well as Indigenous leadership. AI, like all technologies, must be shaped by those who understand the responsibilities that come with knowledge, ensuring it serves communities rather than extracts from them. Generative AI and other forms of AI have extensive potential to benefit Indigenous peoples and our communities. But to make room for what is seemingly an inevitable future that involves AI, more work must be done in both policy and professional bodies to ensure Indigenous inclusion at all levels, from development to use. More critical conversations are needed about these problematics, particularly about the environmental impacts of mundane use, like asking questions that could be solved by using our own intelligence rather than artificial. It is clear we need further guidance on Indigenous cultural and intellectual property rights and culturally appropriate AI use. There are many benefits of generative AI, but there are clearly many risks. Generative AI still has much to learn, and Indigenous knowledges has much to teach it. I'll leave you with a thought a friend of mine asked. Where is ChatGPT's elder to guide it and to pull it into line when it's doing the wrong thing? Thank you.
Thank you, Tamika. And now back to Llewellyn. Thanks.
Thank you. So we've talked kind of about the risks and harms and laws that can apply to generative AI and other AI systems. Given all of that, it's critical that we have in place, organizations have in place processes that manage those risks so that you can get the benefits of these systems without kind of the risks. If you're using AI in your organization and things go wrong, it can cause financial losses, it can cause reputational damage, it can cause breaches of the regulatory obligations that we've discussed. In some cases, a single AI-related incident may cause issues in all three of those categories. And despite all of this, what we're seeing is there's an increasing adoption of AI by organizations, but the governance processes that kind of follow that have been slower to come along. According to a survey from last year from Info Exchange, 89% of not-for-profits didn't have any kind of framework or guideline or policy around AI use, even in circumstances where staff were using AI, and less than 1% had a formal approved board policy. And a policy alone probably isn't enough for AI governance, but it goes to show that many organizations just aren't thinking about the AI governance from this perspective yet. And that's not just the not-for-profit sector, that's sort of many sectors have been really slow to act. There is emerging guidance on AI governance to help organizations. In particular, the Australian government has now released its voluntary AI safety standard, which is aimed to help organizations implement AI safely and responsibly. It provides really practical guidance to organizations around what the government considers basically best practice in this space. There are 10 guardrails I've outlined here. It's quite detailed. I think there's 116 different action items under all these guardrails, so I'm not going to go into all of those. It does provide really good guidance, like I was saying, but if your organization is using AI, it might feel a little bit overwhelming. It might be quite a lot of work to actually be compliant with all of this. So rather than kind of diving into the detail of the standard, I wanted to sort of step back and talk to you at a bit of a higher level around some of the things that your organizations might be thinking about when governing AI systems. And good governance of good AI governance is really just about applying the principles of good governance to AI systems. And we have what we call our 8 elements of good AI governance here. I think what's important to note, there's no sort of one-size-fits-all answer for each of these elements. It's going to depend on your organization. I will kind of go through each of these briefly, but if you do want more detail, we did publish a guidance paper with the Australian Institute of Company Directors last year, talking about AI governance in that. So kind of turning to the elements, accountability, roles and responsibility is a really important step. So it's about ensuring that you have someone in your organization that is accountable for and has oversight of AI systems. Both at sort of the system level, so maybe there's someone in the IT team who's looking after it, but then also at the executive level. So, who's actually making decisions about what kind of AI systems you are going to be using in your organization. Governance structures are a way of then formalizing that accountability. So this is really, do you create some kind of new group within your organization to deal with AI issues, or can you integrate it into existing processes? So, we're seeing lots of organizations create AI governance committees or councils or working groups to help them transition in the adoption of AI systems. But for smaller organizations, it might not be realistic to adopt that approach. You might need to kind of leverage existing processes. But whatever kind of structures you do adopt or processes, people, skills and culture is a really important element, because as you might have the best policies in the world, but it really comes down to the culture that you have in your organization. And to do that, really, training is a really important element. So people understand the risks and harms that we've talked about and how they might impact, your clients or your other stakeholders. Not everyone needs to become an AI expert, but we talk about people having a minimum viable understanding of AI. So they understand it enough so that they can use it effectively in their jobs. Strategy, principles and policies. Strategy, I think, is a really important piece. There's a lot of hype around AI at the moment, but organizations shouldn't be just rushing to adopt AI for the sake of AI. You need to be thinking about what problem are you actually trying to solve in your organization with AI systems, and is AI even the right solution to that problem? And then once you have that, you really want to make sure that it's being deployed in a way which is in line with your organization's values and principles. When it comes to AI principles, the Australian government has a set of AI ethical principles, which I think reflect a kind of common consensus around the key ethical principles in this space. But the research is pretty clear that having principles alone doesn't actually do that much. You need to actually put that into practice. You need to put in place policies around AI use. And in turn, those policies need to have kind of clear practices and processes and controls. An important control really is around that risk management piece. So thinking about your organization's risk appetite when it comes to AI, given some of these risks that we have and the impact that it can have in terms of discrimination, we particularly with dealing with vulnerable clients and their personal data, you might want to veer into areas where you're taking a less risky approach. The next element is the supporting infrastructure, which is really about those kind of existing policies and procedures that you might have. So, you probably already have privacy and data and cybersecurity policies in place. How do we need to update those to manage the new risks or amplified risks that are coming from AI systems? Stakeholder engagement is another really kind of important area, but often neglected element. So last year we did some research into how workers are experiencing the impact of AI, talking to nurses and retail workers and public servants. And most people feel like AI is being imposed on them, that their organizations aren't really consulting with them, that if it is, it's fairly tokenistic or lip service. But actually, when you do engage with workers, they can provide some really valuable insights into how these technologies can help and support them. So rather than just looking, as AI as a way of replacing people, looking at AI as a way of supporting your people and working out how best to do that by actually talking to them. And last but not least is sort of monitoring, reporting, and evaluation. The risks of AI or the risk and the benefit of AI is that they learn and adapt. So, AI models can change as after they are deployed. You're never going to get the exact same answer from an LLM. And that, creates issues where you need to be kind of monitoring and watching the performance of these systems. That's probably a lot of different things to think about. We have tried to condense this into a kind of checklist of things for not-for-profit organizations to think about. And ultimately, your governance approaches need to be proportionate to how you're using AI in your organization. You might not need to take extension actions in relation to all of those steps. You might just need to start to think about some actions that you need to take. We sort of set out this staged process. In the first stage, you're really thinking about how you're using AI, how else you could use AI to add value to your organization, how to mitigate the risks from AI use to your organizations and to your stakeholders, and what are the kind of processes and controls you need to put in place, and making sure that people in the organization understand, particularly senior people, enough about it to be making those decisions. The second step is really then kind of building on that foundation, looking at that engagement with stakeholders, making sure that you have policies, particularly that allow people, if they're affected by AI decisions, to get answers or to get further information. And that training is really important. And there are some free resources out there. We have produced a video series with the National AI Centre, which is sort of a basic introduction to what is AI and different AI tools. And then the final step is that sort of continuous development. Like I said, you need to have that ongoing monitoring and reporting. you need to sort of consider, if you are looking into further high risk uses of AI, do you need to put in place further additional standards? We have produced a whole range of different free resources, which are available on our website for people who'd like to find out more about AI governance. So please feel free to check those out, or feel free to get in contact with me if you'd like to find out more about AI governance. Thank you.
Thank you. Those resources look excellent. I can't wait to check them out. Thank you to all the speakers. Now, I had a few questions prepared, but as you were talking, more were popping up in my head. So I think the first was around what you see as a social impact, specifically of AI in R communities. Is there anything that any of you would like to add to that specific question about where it's specifically impacting R communities?
Well, I was just going to say the digital divide issue for artists is a big one. So there are sort of artists in more remote areas who are really interested in using technologies who just won't have access to it, but also trying to just understand the breadth of the impact of the tools on them when they're in a position of thinking they need legal help because their work's been misappropriated or infringed or whatever it is. Sort of also exacerbates that divide a little bit. That's probably all my legs would say on that.
I think that technological solutions are often posed as the shortcut to improving access to justice for many people in III areas. But I think what you're pointing out is that digital divide itself can create further inequities there.
Yeah, maybe just to add on that digital divide point, I think, we've talked a lot about the risks and harms, but I think there's also that risk of kind of missing out on the opportunities that AI systems pose. There was a report released earlier this week called The Digital Lives of Australians, which sort of tracks, internet and AI use and other things across Australia. And perhaps you wouldn't be surprised to learn that, people in capital cities are using AI professionally and personally at much higher rates than people in regional areas. And, we're also seeing that there are low levels of trust in Australians when it comes to AI systems. And I think part of the way you get over or address some of those trust issues is by actually starting to use the tools and see what they are capable of, what they can't do, what some of the risks and harms are. And if, regional areas aren't getting that kind of exposure and access and use of these tools, if their digital literacy and AI literacy skills aren't being built, if they aren't kind of playing and exploring the opportunities that some of these tools offer, that kind of digital divide and that economic divide may continue.
Thank you. And Tamika?
I agree with everything that's been said, and I also come back to the more that we normalise AI use, there remains a divide on the type of technology you can access based on your income, that you can pay for better access. And I think that is something that will impact and does impact our R communities as well. And I think, remembering the things that we value in society, like caring for one another, relationships, collaborations and connections, and knowing that AI cannot replace those key things.
I think it's interesting too to consider that with greater remoteness, we know that there is a larger proportion of people who do not have internet to the home. So therefore they're relying on perhaps mobile internet. And I'd imagine a lot of those are younger people who have the mobile in their hands, who might be helping out older generation as well. So I'd like to throw in there the question, to what extent do you think education, and I'm talking high school at least, has a responsibility to formalise education of the risks of use of AI products for teenagers? Maybe Tamika, you might have a view on that one.
I think I'm so drawn to the recent MIT study that demonstrated that AI use is directly having an impact on our brain function. And I think of someone, when I consider my own AI use, I would never look to AI to do something that I don't know how to do, right? Because it's just a tool that should enhance and make life easier. Whereas I'm finding that students and young people, when I ask them how they think, what they think about something or how they feel about something, their automated response is to ask Uncle Chatty. And that's really scary because we want the next generation to be critical thinkers, to ask questions of authority and have those really deep conversations. And I worry what it looks like when we have young people that are defaulting to ask something else how they think and how they feel.
I was going to share two, I guess, anecdotes. The first is that I remember when generative AI felt very, very new, because it was, and lecturers, teachers used to say, how do you know if someone's used ChatGPT? And the answer then was, because the essay's really good. And then the next spate of sort of awareness and understanding was off the back of, the New York lawyer, was it Stephen Schwartz or something like that, who had, it included hallucinated cases in his submissions. And so by then people were more and more aware of the big problems with relying on it as a research tool. And so then I started to set questions for mostly IP law students, but some art students as well, that were about information to do with, say, copyright. And the students, this is before I understood the environmental impact, I have to say. Students had to use ChatGPT to turn up an answer of some kind and then correct it, which is a much harder thing to do when it has that sheen of plausibility, and the case is nearly right, but it's fundamentally wrong because of some very subtle reason. And that, I think, demonstrated what Tamika's getting to too, with the risk on learning and, how we synthesize and understand knowledge, and also the knowledge and awareness we have about what the tools are doing, because first of all, it's much harder to correct something that looks right, and you need an incredible level of knowledge to know it's wrong. But then we're building up more and more incorrect knowledge through these processes of using it. And I imagine the digital divide applies the same way to other divides and inequalities around awareness and teaching about how to use the tools properly, such that there's just not enough awareness of the pitfalls and the mistakes that can be made. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe just to add, as I mentioned, Australia has really low levels of trust in AI systems compared to many other countries in the world. And our rates of AI use and literacy are also lower than many other countries in the world. Particularly interestingly, the developing nations are really embracing generative AI technologies and upskilling and learning about this area. So I think that skills and education piece really will go hand in hand with helping people understand how to use this technology safely, and then building that trust in the way that people are using it.
Thank you. So to lead on from that, what conversations do you think that CLCs, and especially Triple R ones, should be having with and about their clients in relation to the use of AI? I think it is interesting to see in the guidelines that CLC New South Wales have recently put out on the use of AI, that we should be having conversations with our clients, for example, about whether they have used any AI tools in order to produce any of the material that they're providing to us. So I think this discussion has certainly extended my thinking in that respect.
It's really hard to give, interesting, high level, short enough descriptions of the implications for infringing other people's work, but I would love if that were part of the conversation that people were having, that if you have produced something using one of the systems or tools, do you understand what the large language models process for ingestion and output actually is? And when you're checking a box that says, there are all sorts of ways in which users and creators of content of all kinds are now in compliance with sort of transparency and disclosure requirements for generative AI, sort of ticking a box saying that they haven't used it, but understanding what that actually means and whether or not that's real, I think is a conversation worth having, but it, you know, it needs to be developed so that it's digestible and easily understood.
Yeah, I think I'd echo that, particularly that point about transparency. You know, if you're using AI systems, we repeatedly hear people want to know, they want to be told if, you know, you're using AI tools and if you're, you know, interacting with them. So if your organization is and you're working with clients, I think that's really important to share that with them. I think it's also just important to, you know, be talking to them about some of the risks and harms around AI systems. I think, you know, a lot of these harms people won't necessarily know when their rights are being infringed by AI tools. And it may be then hard for people to kind of enforce their rights in that situation. You know, we're hearing similarly from regulators as well, that there is a lot of interest in this area and they are interested in kind of protecting people's rights when it comes to AI. But unless they kind of get the complaints, unless they hear from people, they can't really, you know, they can't take action. So I guess, yeah, keeping an eye out and an ear out for any of these issues as they impact clients, and then thinking about how you can support them, particularly in making those complaints to regulators about any of those issues.
Tamika, did you have anything to add there?
Not too much to add on this one, but I think, you know, in this scenario, when it comes to clients, like I think there's a very big difference between, you know, fabricating something completely using an AI tool versus, you know, getting a structure or a scaffold for a support letter, for example. You know, there's a blanket approach really doesn't fit. It is really about having those critical conversations and being transparent about use, and, you know, not creating more fear, but also being realistic about what's appropriate use and what isn't.
The Productivity Commission seems to be approaching AI with a view that it will increase productivity generally, and their economic reform roundtable is scheduled for August this year. So what should we be doing in the sector to advocate in this space, do you think?
Advocate against that approach. No. I think it's a very flawed approach, I have to say, for all sorts of reasons, and I'm not sure it will have a you know, inherently positive impact on our cultural economy, certainly, and that will have consequences, you know, in terms of all of the intersectional concerns that people have talked about earlier in the day as well, to do with the significance of cultural production for lots of vulnerable communities. So yeah, I will be interested to see what is recommended, and certainly think it will probably be worth being quite critical about, you know, analysing the recommendations.
Yeah, I think because AI is sort of seen as the panacea or the magic solution when it comes to Australia's productivity issues. But actually, you know, the statistics say 80% of AI projects fail. I've heard other reports where executives are saying, you know, only 1 in 4 of them are reporting return on investment from AI systems. And in our view, part of that is really there's a lack of that stakeholder engagement with workers, and kind of actually connecting, you know, these AI tools with workers and understanding how we can best use them in that context. So I think really, you know, for CLCs, part of the advocacy is kind of being in these conversations, and, you know, sharing the experiences of your clients, because often I've been to a lot of these roundtables and other consultations, and they're dominated by, you know, large companies, tech companies, government, academics, and unfortunately, often the civil society voice is missing, or it's limited. So I think making sure that voice comes through in these conversations is important.
Can I just add one point there really quickly, which is to say, in other government consultations about this issue, that's exactly right in terms of the makeup of the roundtable consulted, and it's this really weird equivalence between big tech, who are already profiting and have already possibly, breached and broken and infringed loads of laws and rights, and that's already happened, and the profits are enormous. And an equal representation to people who've lost everything or stand to lose everything and more in these discussions. And I think that's probably a useful point for the sector to keep in mind as well, is that it's already an incredibly, ridiculously unfair playing field. And that's important to understand from the outset.
And amplifying those voices of those who can't.
Yeah.
Great. So what should CLCs keep in mind if we are outsourcing systems like recruitment or payroll, and the way that might impact on our workforce?
I think it's really having good discussions with your suppliers around some of these issues that we've talked about today. If you are looking at recruitment tools, then sort of interrogating with the suppliers, well, how are they managing some of the bias issues, and particularly issues around data and data security. How, if they're going to be holding your data, where are they going to be storing that? Is that going to be used for training purposes, and thinking through kind of what your legal obligations are as an organization, and, how you can align those with what the supplier is going to provide. And also think, maybe take everything that they say with a pinch of salt. There's a lot of hype around AI, and a lot of vendors are promising, amazing solutions. And the reality is, I don't think all of them are kind of living up to that hype at this stage.
I would agree with that. I don't think we can fall into this trap that AI is somehow a cure-all that will make all aspects of our lives easier. Some things shouldn't have the human decision-making element removed, as we have mentioned, the multiple ways that these systems will impact marginalized people. I think it's a slippery slope when we get to places where these decisions are being made without any human touch or human care.
Thank you. And now I think we're going to probably have 10 minutes still for audience questions or comments. Who would like to start? So excited.
So I'm a member of a heavily regulated profession, and most of the professions in our community who are instrumental in meeting our daily needs or shaping our society are heavily regulated. I can't just be a pharmacist in my garage and make medication. I can't be a doctor without regulation. I can't be a nurse without regulation. I can't be a teacher without regulation. Accounting, dentistry. All of these professional bodies have really rigid professional oversight structures in place. And obviously the IT professional is a relatively new profession, and these professionals have entered into society and have considerable weight around the way that we're shaping our world. But there's no regulatory oversight of who gets to build this software and the inputs that get to go into this software. So what scope, because I guess from a legal perspective, what we're talking about here is a regulatory environment where we're going to regulate how I draft my affidavit, but we're not going to regulate who gets to draft the affidavit. What scope do you think that there is for us as a society to be advocating for professional regulation around who's building AI?
I think it's a really, interesting concept. I think you're right. Like, data scientists, the people who build these systems, they don't have these obligations on them. And, although I was talking about the laws that apply, general laws that apply in Australia, there aren't those specific regulations that apply to those individuals yet. The Australian government, as I said, is currently going through a consultation to consider imposing new regulations around AI systems. So they may mirror some of the requirements in the voluntary AI safety standard, and create mandatory requirements, particularly for people who are sort of developing and deploying AI systems. So there may be some regulation coming in this space, particularly for those higher risk systems. But yeah, I think there is more that needs to be done. Absolutely.
Anyone else? Yes, sorry.
Yeah, thanks. Look, I sort of came in a bit late. Very sorry about that. But also at the same time, I was just quickly reading a really interesting article that came out the General Assembly, the MRIP expert mechanism rights indigenous peoples, and I just recently did a article on First Nations peoples and artificial intelligence. And also as well, one thing I was just wondering as well too, the NIAA has made a commitment to be able to look at preserving Indigenous data sovereignty as well. And maybe Tamika, could you sort of like help understand how the regulation of AI could intersect with that right to data sovereignty, and what sort of challenges could there be?
I think the biggest thank you for that great question. I think the biggest challenge at the moment is that there is a lack of regulation, and what we kind of see is that Indigenous peoples are left out of the conversation completely because we're perceived as not being digital users or people with digital lives. So I think data sovereignty is really the key thing here to unlock what regulation would look like. And we see Indigenous communities over the globe harnessing AI for language revitalization, for example. So it's this this balance of demonstrating that we can use AI in ways that benefit our communities, that draw on our knowledges, that center Indigenous governance, whilst also ensuring how do we regulate systems that aren't Indigenous, that don't have Indigenous people's input or understand Indigenous values. So I think, even the Closing the Gap strategy, emphasizes the importance of Indigenous communities to have control of our data. But where does AI come into this? It's I don't have the answers yet, but I think UNDRIP is a really, important starting point.
Thanks, Tamika. One more question there as well. I'm a bit more of a ILO 169 myself, but I want to ask, there's Terry Denke had done a book on True Tracks, and she had a number of principles on how to engage First Nations peoples on their information, how to be able to collect it safely as well too. Do you believe that could be part of the solution towards that?
Absolutely. True Tracks is the perfect model when it comes to considerations for AI use. And, that paired with the Mayam Ngari Wangara's approach to governance will really go from strength to strength if we can regulate these things at all.
Just scanning the room for any more comments or questions. Otherwise, I have one final quick question. But no. Okay, my final question to the panel members is, if you had your finger on a button and you could keep or delete AI technology as we currently know, given the risks and benefits we've spoken about today, what would you do?
I'd probably delete, I have to say. Yeah, I'd probably delete. Yeah. Yeah, no, I just think for all the reasons we've talked about, but also just the point about have we actually regulated? Have we thought about the implications, or if have people just done what they're doing and we are where we are without having? Yeah, I think we needed to put guardrails up prior to things going this far, really. Yeah.
I think I would keep. I think we kind of haven't gotten into some of the benefits of AI systems, but they are certainly there. And I guess I'm optimistic and hopeful that although we don't have all the guardrails in place yet, maybe through good governance and regulation, we can help steer it in the right direction.
Yeah, I'd pause if there was a
pause should have been a third option.
I would pause or delete. I think having marked essays, about 150 essays in the past month, with fabricated references attributed to me, saying, Worrell 2018 said this or he said this, which is even more interesting when we are seeing full fabricated interactions created in essays, or students, you know, making up interactions they had with peers in classes that they didn't even attend. So I would delete or pause for sure.
I've had a similar experience, Tamika, I have to say, and that sometimes even with law students, they show better engagement, analysis, and argument in a response to a referral for doing that than they did in the original paper.
Absolutely. If only they put in that work in the first place.
Okay. Were there any questions from online that I can't see? No? Okay. Unless there's anything further from the audience, we might end it there. Thank you so much to our panelists.